Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Campaigns, Elections, and the Threat to Democracy: What Everyone Needs to Know, 2nd edition. By Dennis W. Johnson. Narrated by Jonathan Todd Ross. Preface to the 2nd edition. Why you need to know about campaigns, elections, and the threat to democracy. So much has changed in American elections since the first edition of this book was published just 3 years ago. Even the title has changed, to reflect not only our concern about campaigns and elections, but also the threats to democracy that have recently surfaced. In this edition, there are 2 new chapters on the extraordinary 2020 presidential election between incumbent Donald Trump and challenger Joe Biden. Under normal circumstances, this book would not focus on just one presidential election. But the events surrounding the 2020 election were so unique, so contentious, and in the end such a threat to democratic norms and standards, that this election deserves special treatment in this volume. In chapters 6 and 7, we will discuss the extraordinary campaign events, the impact of the pandemic, the shift to mail-in voting, the attempts by President Trump to raise substantial doubt about the election before it even occurred, and, most consequentially, the big lie, the attempt by Trump and his allies to subvert the vote of the people and upset the Electoral College vote. The final section, Chapter 12, on the threats to democracy, is greatly expanded and updated. It focuses on the growing distrust in American institutions and the flurry of laws passed by Republican-dominated state legislatures to restrict access to voting and to trim the powers of state election officials. We look at the Democratic responses to these attempts at voter suppression and the struggle in Congress to protect voting rights and the integrity of the voting process. American democracy is indeed under threat, and we all need clear, authoritative, unbiased answers about campaigns, elections, and the integrity of our democratic systems and institutions. This updated and thoroughly revised edition will help us sift through the noise and false narratives of those trying to undermine democratic values and institutions. The right of all citizens to vote and participate in elections is a bedrock principle of American democracy. It has been a hard-won right, overcoming prejudice, stubborn resistance, and blatant discrimination grounded in state law and practice. In our textbook versions, citizens are given the opportunity to choose their representatives and to vote on issues without fear of intimidation, knowing that the elections will be fairly conducted and the decision of the voters will be abided by. Citizens also are assured that elections will be held on a frequent and regular basis, usually every 2 or 4 years. Our concept of democracy also assumes that citizens will be active in public affairs, not just voting but also learning about issues, supporting candidates for office, even donating money and working on campaigns. But now, in the 3rd decade of the 21st century, our campaign and election systems are not working the way the textbooks taught us. We have seen profound changes in how campaigns are conducted, how voters get their information, who gives money to campaigns, how the highest court has interpreted the relationship between money and free speech, how campaign consultants have used their influence, how a president and his followers have denigrated the electoral process and have pushed a big lie about the 2020 election results, and how outside forces have tried to impact, and sometimes have succeeded in impacting, elections. Before we move on, let's define 2 key words: elections and campaigns. Through an election, citizens have the chance to choose from among candidates for public office who will, if elected, vote on policy issues. Usually, elections are held on a fixed day, very often in early November for a general election. Sometimes there are special elections, often to fill a seat vacated by a death or resignation, primaries, to determine which of several candidates will represent a political party, and occasionally runoff elections, when the leading primary candidates have not reached a certain percentage of votes during the first round. In over half the states, an election can also include ballot issues, where there is no candidate, only policy issues at stake. For example, whether to have a lottery or permit marijuana for recreational use. Elections are conducted and monitored by state and local officials. Candidates are chosen to fill government jobs, and policy issues are decided. A campaign is the active side of an election, announcing a candidacy, raising and debating issues, scheduling meet-and-greet dinners and rallies, raising campaign funds, identifying potential voters, communicating through social media and television, and getting voters out to the polling stations. Much of what we'll discuss in this book deals with the changing dynamics and mechanisms of campaigning. But over recent years, unfortunately, we've seen some disturbing trends. Thanks to federal court decisions, the federal campaign finance laws have been almost entirely blown out of the water. We used to require transparency. Now, millions of campaign dollars can be hidden. We used to have limits on the amount of money that can be donated or spent. That's almost all been taken away. The result is that a handful of megadonors, those willing to give $25 million or $50 million of their own money, often hidden from public view, to a campaign, can have a major impact on statewide and other races. Campaigns are no longer contests between one candidate and another. Organized interests, many of them hidden behind innocent-sounding names, have flooded campaigns with their pitches, ads, and organizational muscle. In the 2016 presidential election, more adults sat at home than voted for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. In many big city mayoral elections, little more than 15% or 20% of the voters cast ballots. While the 2018 and 2020 elections saw big increases in voter participation, the United States still lags far behind most democracies in citizen involvement. Many voters simply don't know what media to trust anymore. Fake news found on social media sites, much of it coming from other countries, confuses voters and distorts reality. A president barking fake news, pushing false information about the elections, and disparaging the mainstream press certainly doesn't help. Mistrust of government and its institutions is at an all-time high, and partisanship and the ideological divide are as corrosive as they have ever been. That mistrust has been fueled by the 2020 big lie, former President Trump's refusal to accept the reality of his defeat and his efforts to punish those Republicans who defy him. This book will try to sort out what is real, what is confusing, and what everyone should know about campaigns and elections. It poses 157 questions and answers that are based on federal law and court decisions, the findings of scholars and campaign practitioners, and an analysis of historical events. The book is divided into 12 chapters, with questions and answers focused on a common theme. Chapter 1 concerns voting and participation. We'll look at how our elections work, how our participation rates compare with other countries, the long, tortured history of gaining the right to vote for women and minorities, voting fraud, and how we protect our electoral process. In Chapter 2, the focus is on the creation of legislative districts. We'll look at how state legislatures create districts, the ongoing battle over gerrymandering and creating districts favorable to one party or the other, and how states lose or gain congressional districts following every 10-year census. Chapter 3 is devoted to the role of political parties and elections. How have the Democratic and Republican parties changed over the years? Why don't we have other parties popping up to challenge them? How many people consider themselves independents, and how do they vote during elections? Is the Republican Party basically the Trump Party? We'll also ask whether political parties have surrendered their role in campaigning to wealthy donors and super PACs. In Chapter 4, we'll look at statewide, local, and congressional elections. We start with a simple question. How many local and state government offices require election by voters? We'll also look at how local candidates communicate with voters when television is too expensive. Historically, women have not run for office in the same numbers as men. Has this changed in the era of Donald Trump? In Chapter 5, we look at presidential elections. Several questions surround our cumbersome and antiquated electoral college system. Why do we have this system in the first place? Who wants to change it, and how could it be changed? We'll also look at questions about our lengthy primary system. How did we get to the point of having all these primaries, and aren't there ways to shorten the process? Why don't we have a straight up and down nationwide vote where whoever gets the most votes wins? Chapter 6 is new to this edition, and we explore in detail the 2020 presidential election. President Trump lost by 7 million votes, but, thanks to our antiquated electoral college system, came within an eyelash of winning. We'll look at the impact of COVID, the massive use of mail-in balloting, and the surprising turnout of voters on both sides. In Chapter 7, we will look at the big lie, the repeated attempts by President Trump to deny the legitimacy of the contest, even before any votes were counted. And we'll go into the Stop the Steal effort, showing who was behind it, who aided and abetted the effort, and how courageous state and local officials, many of them Republican, blocked the falsehoods. We now know that Trump's own advisers knew that the so-called steal was nothing but a sham. We'll look at those elected officials who, either by their aggressive actions or more usually by their silence, were complicit. In Chapter 8, we examine the impact of money in campaigns, with the influence of megadonors and wide-open spending. So much has changed in the past few years. What's the difference between hard money, soft money, and dark money? How have Supreme Court decisions profoundly changed the way we regulate campaign financing? We'll look at the agencies responsible for overseeing federal campaign financing, especially the Federal Election Commission and the Internal Revenue Service. We'll identify some of the wealthiest donors and see what their impact may have been. But we'll also look at what average citizens can contribute. In Chapter 9, we look at campaign consultants. What are the roles of campaign managers, pollsters, and media specialists, big data consultants, get-out-the-vote specialists, and a legion of other campaign operatives? We'll ponder the question, if Hillary Clinton had an all-star team of consultants, why was she beaten by Trump's team, which could at best be described as second tier? How do campaigns and political consultants run a political campaign during a COVID pandemic? Chapter 10 is devoted to direct democracy and ballot campaigns. How do ballot campaigns work, and what kinds of issues typically appear on ballots? We'll also look at why ballot issues are a goldmine for political consultants, especially in California. We'll look at the attempt to recall the California governor in 2021, and we'll explore the dicey issue of whether there should be a system for holding nationwide ballot elections. In Chapter 11, we'll look at how campaigns have changed since the beginning of the digital age. We'll look at the revolution in micro-targeting and big data, explore the impact of social media, and look at the role of that tried-and-true communications tool, television. Finally, Chapter 12 wraps up our exploration of campaigns and elections by asking whether our system and our actions pose a threat to democracy. We'll look at the attempts by Republican-controlled state legislatures to restrict voting access, and at Democratic-dominated state legislatures attempting to broaden the right to vote. We'll look at Russian hacking, fake news, the vulnerability of our election system to cyber warfare, homegrown terrorism, and other issues. We'll probe the question, which is worse? Russian and other foreign actors attempting to mess with our elections, or homegrown attempts to subvert the will of the people and cast doubts on our electoral system. We'll also tackle the question, what can citizens do to better understand how money is spent and how they can better participate in these most important components of citizenship? In all, we'll gain a much better understanding of how elections and campaigns work, the strengths and weaknesses of our democratic institutions, and how we can make our system better. Chapter 1. Voting and Participation. Compared to other democracies, the United States has a mediocre record of voter participation. Our interest usually peaks during presidential elections. In 2020, there were a record number of voters, reaching 67% of eligible citizens, but that was far above the usual rate of voting. For local elections and ballot measures, voter participation is often much lower. The United States has had a long history of denying citizens the right to vote, and today there is pressure to clamp down against alleged voter fraud. Elections are administered at the state and local levels, but despite federal assistance, many of the state systems are fragile and vulnerable to electronic fraud and political chicanery. How does the United States conduct elections? The most familiar method of conducting elections is called the single winner system. The candidate with the most votes wins. There are two versions of the single winner system. The first is the plurality voting method, which means that no matter what percentage of the vote the top vote getter receives, that candidate is declared the winner. This is how our federal elections, for the House of Representatives and the Senate, work, as well as many gubernatorial and other statewide contests. The winning candidate doesn't need a majority of votes, 50% plus one vote, just the most votes. The second version is the majority voting method, in which the winning candidate must receive a majority of the votes. When there are many candidates and none receives a majority, states and other jurisdictions with majority systems will hold a runoff between the top two candidates. Our presidential election system, of course, is also a single winner system, but the outcome depends not on popular vote, but on having the majority of electors from the Electoral College. We'll discuss in much more detail how the Electoral College works in Chapter 5, and examine in depth the problems found in the 2020 election in Chapters 6 and 7. We also have a multiple winner system. This usually occurs at the local level in cities and countries, as the chief feature is that several candidates are declared winners. For example, there might be 4 available seats in a local at-large election and 7 candidates. The top 4 vote-getters will be declared the winners. Another system called ranked choice voting, RCV, is used in a number of municipalities, including San Francisco and Minneapolis, and it is employed statewide in Maine. In total, RCV has now been adopted in 15 states, from Alaska to Florida. Instead of just choosing one candidate, voters rank their preferences. When there are multiple candidates, if the top vote-getter doesn't receive a majority, then the candidate with the lowest number of votes will be eliminated. At that point, the voters' second choices will be considered. Ultimately, a winner will emerge with a majority of the votes. In 2018, a congressman from Maine lost his bid for re-election under a newly installed RCV system. He had the highest number of votes, but not a majority. When the votes were calculated using the RCV method, his opponent gained more than 50% of the vote and was declared the winner. The effect is very similar to a runoff election, and has the benefit of ensuring that an outlier candidate who gains perhaps only 15% to 20% of the vote doesn't come in first in a multi-candidate race. The biggest recent test of RCV was in the New York City mayoral primary, held in June 2021, with 8 candidates vying for the Democratic nomination. In this very public contest, RCV may have been confusing to voters, but even more so to city election officials, who struggled to come up with the eventual winner. What's the historical background on the right to vote in America? We pride ourselves that nearly every American adult is eligible to vote. Right now, the only people who cannot vote are convicted felons, those with mental incapacities, and residents who are not citizens. But as we will see, many Americans fail to register, are somehow blocked or intimidated, or simply do not take advantage of the right to vote, particularly in state and local elections. The history of extending the right to vote in this country has been long and torturous. As historian Alexander Kesar reminds us, at its birth, the United States was not a democratic nation. The very word democracy had pejorative overtones, summoning up images of disorder, government by the unfit, even mob rule. And for many years to come, very few people had the right to vote. Women, nearly all free African Americans, slaves, Native Americans, and white adult males who couldn't meet the property requirements were excluded from the vote. Later, Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans were routinely denied the right to vote. The Civil War brought an end to slavery and also established citizenship for former slaves through the 13th Amendment. African American men obtained the right to vote under the 15th Amendment in 1870. In the South, this was carried out under military-enforced Reconstruction. By 1890, some 147,000 African American men were on the voting rolls in Mississippi. Altogether, 1,500 African Americans were appointed or elected to office in the South from 1870 to 1890. Ironically, several northern states still prohibited blacks from voting. Then came the resurgence of Southern white domination and the purge of black voting rights. Starting with Mississippi in 1890 and spreading throughout the South, there was a massive effort to remove blacks from the voting rolls. Through intimidation, so-called grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, and other devices. It worked. Before the purge, 67% of Mississippi blacks were registered to vote. By 1892, just 4% remained on the rolls. The U.S. Congress did nothing to stop the wholesale elimination of voting rights. So much for the protections of the Constitution. North Carolina Governor Charles Aycock, whose remains rest in the U.S. Capitol crypt, said in 1903 that he was proud of his state for solving the Negro problem. We have taken him out of politics, and have thereby secured good government under any party, and laid foundations for the future development of both races. Let the Negro learn once and for all that there is unending separation of the races, that the two people may develop side by side to the fullest, but that they cannot intermingle. One estimate found that in the 1940s, only 5% of all African Americans living in the South were voting. Full voting protections for African Americans, men and women, did not come until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Women battled for decades to secure the right to vote. Starting in 1848, at the Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York, women activists began to fight throughout the states and in Congress to obtain the right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt, leader of the principal women's suffrage organization, bitterly recounted those battles. 56 referendum campaigns, 480 campaigns to urge state legislatures to submit suffrage amendments to voters, 47 campaigns to include woman suffrage in state constitutions, 277 fights to have state parties include woman suffrage in their platforms, 30 platform fights during presidential elections, and 19 campaigns in each of the Congresses, spanning 38 years. Finally, in 1920, women gained the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. There was a concern, mostly among opponents, that women would form a bloc, even a women's party, to vote their interests. But as women settled into voting, they soon occupied the whole spectrum of ideology and partisan ties. The right to vote was expanded twice more. The 23rd Amendment, 1961, extended the right to vote for president and vice president to the citizens of the District of Columbia. 18-year-olds were granted the right to vote by the 26th Amendment, 1971. The overwhelming sentiment was that if we are asking 18-year-olds to fight in the Vietnam War, then we should allow them to vote as well. The saying was, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote." Why was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 important? What's the importance of the 2013 Shelby County and the 2021 Brnovich decisions? The Voting Rights Act of 1965, together with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, was one of the most important pieces of legislation passed during the 20th century. The Deep South had continued to block or intimidate African American voters, keeping them from exercising one of democracy's most important rights. After civil rights protesters were beaten and jailed in Selma, Alabama in 1965, an exasperated President Lyndon Johnson ordered his Attorney General, "I want you to write me the goddamnest, toughest Voting Rights Act that you can devise." The Voting Rights Act suspended for 5 years all sorts of voting registration requirements that had impeded minority voting in 6 southern states: Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia, and several counties in other states: North Carolina, Arizona, and Hawaii. To back up the law, federal examiners, mostly Southern federal bureaucrats, were sent to those states to monitor the elections. Any new voting requirements or restrictions these states proposed had to be approved by the Justice Department, in a process called pre-clearance. Once the voting restrictions were removed, African American registration increased by 1 million during the first 4 years, and the number of Southern black elected officials doubled. Still, white citizens and groups tried in many ways to circumvent the requirements of the Voting Rights Act and dilute or minimize black voting strength. The Voting Rights Act was renewed several times. The last time was in 2006, when its protections were extended until 2033. But in June 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby County v. Holder that Congress had exceeded its authority in 2006 when it reauthorized the section of the Voting Rights Act that required the pre-clearance of state election laws. In Shelby County, the court said, basically, that the stringent requirements in the original law had been the right thing to do back in 1965, but that things have changed dramatically since then. Congress should have updated the law, said the conservative majority on the court. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion. Congress had failed to make any updates, and thus the pre-clearance provisions, the real heart of the law's enforcement, were ruled unconstitutional. The Supreme Court essentially defanged the Voting Rights Act. Within a few hours of the Shelby County decision, Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott announced that the state's voter identification restrictions would be implemented immediately.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?